Chapter 8. The pleasant luncheon amidst the busy bustle of the general refectory restored everybody's equilibrium to a greater or lesser extent. Zand went along to the dining hall, where there was a fairly large number of other Lhounds sharing the meal with their handlers, so his presence did not receive much notice, except one or two comments about his more than average size. Nor did Queen Eruda's presence evoke much comment. Her presence was respectfully acknowledged by quite a number of people, as well as the serving staff, but it was clear that her practice of taking luncheon in the general dining hall was not an unusual event. At the Queen's gentle insistence, only trivialities were discussed during the meal. Lhounds noticed subliminally that all the councillors and the scribe had their minds tightly sealed, and could not completely suppress an inner ripple of amusement. To his delighted surprise, he picked up a similar feeling from the Queen as she caught his eye, across the dining table, with just the faintest twitch of an expressive eyebrow. The meal passed very pleasantly, and allowed everybody to think about what had happened, whilst indulging in social pleasantries. After visits to the respective ablution facilities on either side of the dining hall, they all reassembled in Queen Eruda's audience chamber just short of an hour after the noon hour. The little busynesses of getting settled at the conference table, activating the room shields again, chairs being pulled up to the table, and water glasses filled and in some instances sipped from, were followed by an expectant silence as all eyes were fixed on the Queen. Some glances did occasionally stray to the Lound, who again was recumbent on the floor, head on paws, eyes already closed, between Lhounds and Anmar's chairs. The Queen, seemingly unaware, was going through her papers and allowing the silence to continue. Predictably, it was Councillor Admeta who broke the silence. "Your Highness," she began somewhat impetuously, and with more than just a hint of impatience in her vibrant voice, "we simply have to talk about what happened before luncheon. I am deeply concerned. With respect to Captain Denarian, is a Lound with such a powerful mind not a great danger to us all?" As Lhounds sat forward in his chair to protest, Queen Eruda raised a calming hand. "Indeed, Admeta, he could be very dangerous to us all, but it is our great good fortune that he is on our side, and as such offers us his abilities as a strength and protection, not a danger." As soon as the Queen stopped talking, Scribe Allen spoke in his dry, precise, and expressionless manner. "Ma'am, you said earlier that you would acquaint us with what you do know about the Linehound's mind. This implies that there are things you suspect about his mind, but are not certain about?" The scribe allowed the interrogative to hang in the air, while the rest of the meeting also looked at the Queen questioningly. Queen Eruda took a deep breath, and with a glance at Lhounds, who nodded, she spoke to the Lound directly. "Zand, this time with your permission?" The Lound raised his head and fixed his fierce golden eyes unblinkingly on the Queen. "Of course, Eruda." Amidst gasps of protest from her councillors at the Lound's perceived familiarity, that she waved away impatiently, the Queen spoke very quietly, in a warm and gentle voice. "I suspect, no. Let me be accurate. I know that Zand is also sensitive. I suspect that he is also a mind healer, as the two qualities often go hand in hand, as is in fact the case with Anmar." Queen Eruda fell silent for a few seconds, then took a long and deep breath. "And I further suspect, though I am hesitant to say this even in this shielded room and amongst this group of people that I would trust with my life, that Zand may be a space bender, a quality that I have only ever twice encountered in my entire life." As she spoke the last words, the Queen's voice dropped very low, but so clear was her enunciation that every word dropped into the silence with raindrop clarity. The ensuing uncomprehending silence lasted for several seconds. Then it was Lhounds who spoke in a similar low tone, hesitancy colouring his words. "But Your Highness, what does a space bender do? I have never even heard of it." Nods and sounds of agreement came from others around the table. The Queen breathed deeply again. "Ah, yes. A space bender can manipulate mind space, and the minds that are open to it. A space bender can create the illusion that time is passing or standing still, or that it has been speeded up or slowed down. A space bender can also create the illusion that there are utterly terrifying presences in mind space that are not really there." And, Queen Eruda continued with a small frown briefly furrowing her smooth brow, "a space bender can dissemble in mind space. He or she can lie telepathically, something that is virtually impossible for any other telepaths to do. Strong telepaths can manage to hide their thoughts and parts of their minds, but they find it extremely difficult, if not outright impossible, to deliberately project untruths. But a space bender can do so very successfully. And, with another rueful shake of the head, a space bender can also eavesdrop on other minds without them even being slightly aware of it." After a brief pause, Queen Eruda concluded, with grim and utter conviction in her voice, A spacebender is without any doubt the most dangerous telepath that there is. Being a spacebender carries with it an almost crushing responsibility and moral obligation to not abuse its destructive potential. A spacebender's powers should only ever be used as a final resort. A deep and thoroughly uneasy silence descended on the room after the Queen's last words, as everybody tried to absorb and understand and come to terms with the frightening spectre that had been raised by her words. Many downright frightened glances were surreptitiously cast at the Lound, who still had his eyes fixed on the Queen in a completely composed and unreadable stare. So it took a few seconds in the deepening silence for her words to truly sink in. "I am a spacebender myself," she said. Then every glance swiveled towards the Queen, and then became riveted on her in profound shock as if she had suddenly sprouted 3 demon horns from her forehead. So utterly focused was the attention of everybody around the table on the Queen, that most of them missed the Lound's initial movement as he rose to his feet. It was only as he moved silently across to stand in front of the Queen, golden eyes locked with her dark grey ones, that he obtruded on everyone's consciousness with renewed shock and indeed consternation again. The latter was further intensified as the Queen raised both hands and placed them on each side of the Lound's face and lightly rocked the massive head from side to side a few times. Her gently mocking mind send was open to all as she said to him, "We are a dangerous pair, are we not, you and I?" Similarly, when the Lound's response came, everyone in the room received it. "We are indeed, my Queen," he sent, and then, incredibly and with wicked amusement, clearly colouring the sending, the Lound continued, "And so is Lhounds. He is a spacebender himself, though he does not know it yet." The Lound then turned lazily to face his handler, who had shot to his feet, and now flicked his startled glance from Queen to Zand and then back to the Queen again. When he spoke, his tone was loud and vehement. No, that makes no sense at all. Surely I would know if I could do anything like that." Queen Aruda spoke in a calming voice. "Not necessarily, Lhounds. And often some of one's telepathic abilities only develop later in life. I was nearly 40 before I realized that I could manipulate mind space." "Yes," came Zand's teasing sending. "You have to grow up first. It needs maturity." The Queen laughed softly and gestured for Lhounds to sit down. When he was seated again, though still sitting forward in his chair in obvious agitation, she leant towards him and gripped his forearm in a surprisingly strong grip. "Do not fret about this, Lhounds. This is good news. Really, really good news. I will train you myself, with Zand's help, of course. If my darkest suspicions prove to be accurate, and I wish with every fibre of my being that they are not, we are going to need every particle of help we can muster in the coming struggle. You being a spacebender, along with Zand and myself, will add greatly to our resources." And into mind space came Zand's chilling and implacable assertion. "Yes, Lhounds, we will be very strong together with Aruda." And then, just for the merest flicker of the shortest split second of time, mind space swirled vertiginously around everybody in the room in a terrifying demonstration of the spacebender's magical craft. Then it was gone, and everybody except the Queen wondered if they had imagined it. The Queen looked at Zand, while a grim and yet hopeful expression flitted across her face. "Yes," she mind-sent to him alone. "Yes." And then, directed to him, and out of habitual courtesy to Lhounds as well, she requested, "Now calm everybody down, please." The Queen leant back in her chair and made a point of visibly relaxing. She was conscious of a slackening of tension in the room, as Zand's calming sending unobtrusively yet compellingly permeated mind space. For a few moments she added her own calming input to his, whilst ostensibly sorting through her papers and making a few notes before putting them in a neat pile in front of her on the table. Only when she knew that the agitation levels in the room were significantly reduced did the Queen go on. "Now we come to the second part of this meeting, in which we will share some information with our visitors that I am fairly certain they do not have. It will also clear up the mystery for them as to why I took them on a visit to our bamboo structures in the garden earlier today before our meeting." She smiled warmly at Anmar, Dane, and Lhounds before continuing with an eloquent shrug of her shoulders. "There is no sensible way of putting this, so I am just going to come right out and tell you about what has been an utterly inexplicable mystery to us. We suspect that it has been going on for a long time, but it was only discovered over recent moons. To put it as simply and as unambiguously as possible, the bamboo tunnels in the southern bamboo forests have been disappearing." She looked at the uncomprehending faces of the 3 visitors and lifted her shoulders in a helpless, baffled shrug, and said with a brief laugh, "Yes, I know. It sounds completely ludicrous and nonsensical, but this is what has been happening. Established bamboo tunnels that have been there for years and years are literally there one day and gone the next. They have not been dying, or been destroyed or damaged. They are simply gone. Somebody or something has been physically removing them and taking them away. The first few tunnels that disappeared were uprooted, but I suppose that must have been too time-consuming, for since then they have all been cut off very neatly, flush with the ground. The Queen's frustration was clearly evident. Equally clear was the fact that her councillors and scribes shared this feeling in equal measure. Some moments passed in disgruntled expressions of this frustrated bafflement, before Queen Eruda said, "Bernard and Anmar, please share your visual and sense images from this morning with Zand, so he can absorb his first impressions about these tunnels from familiar minds." They did so, leaving their minds open so that Queen Eruda and her people could follow their exchanges as well. By the end of their mind sense, Zand appeared just as mystified as they were. After this, Queen Eruda asked Councillor Padam to take over the account, as he knows more about bamboo and the bamboo industry than any of us, and everybody must be getting tired of my voice. He smilingly disagreed with the Queen. "Hardly, Your Highness, on both counts," but willingly acceded to the Queen's request. "Am I safe in assuming that you are not familiar with the bamboo industry?" he started off. As they all nodded, he continued. "Bamboo is a very useful but rather strange plant. Some of the varieties that are cultivated in the bamboo forests grow for a very long time before flowering and seeding. And after flowering and seeding, the bamboo plants all die off. Some of this dead bamboo is used, but as it is quite dry and brittle, most of it is chopped down, the old roots are dug out, and then everything is burnt to help fertilize the soil. After that, the burnt area is left fallow for some moons, whereafter new bamboo seedlings are planted, and the whole cycle starts all over again. Just before flowering, however, the plants have attained their maximum growth, flexibility, and strength, so that is the best time for harvesting, especially the bamboo used in the building industry, particularly for scaffolding, and in our crystal mines for shoring up tunnels. So careful records are kept, and have been kept for many, many years, about when which sections of the forest were planted and when they are due to flower and seed. Large areas are allowed to do so, as the seed is harvested as an important component of the feed given by our lowland farmers to their elk herds and cattle and other livestock. The Dale farmers also use it in the feed they give to their poultry, especially their terra-geese flocks, and the forest dwellers themselves utilize it in all sorts of ways, even in their cooking. So the point that I'm trying to make is that there are large, in fact huge, tracts of the bamboo forests that are not actively being cultivated all the time, but are allowed to get on with what bamboo does best, namely grow vigorously and uninterrupted all on its own. Councillor Padam's enthusiasm for his subject was clearly evident as he continued. And in these areas there are tunnels that are not regularly used at all, just maintained according to a fairly relaxed maintenance schedule to assure that the tunnels will be usable when they are needed. And it is almost invariably these tunnels, in temporarily unsupervised sections of the western forests, with very little or no human activity, that have disappeared. The first time it was discovered was in the hot, dry season, just before the rainy season sets in, just before a team of seed harvesters was scheduled to harvest the ripe seed pods from a section that had flowered the year before. A small advance team was sent on ahead, as is always done, a few days before the harvesting, or any extensive work in the forest for that matter, is due to start, to get the camp ready where the workers live while the harvesting is going on. There are many of these unoccupied basic village structures all over the forest that are used only when needed, when a specific section of the forest is being worked. They are all in secure bamboo enclosures with a number of basic huts, a well, cooking and ablution facilities, just adequate so that the workers, who obviously bring their own food and basic necessities with them, can live in reasonable comfort and safety while the work is going on. And well, to put it simply, the advance team literally ran out of tunnel. One moment they were still travelling through a secure tunnel on their maintenance cart with all their equipment behind the sturdy forest ponies that pulled it, and the next moment they were out of the tunnel and in the bamboo forest, unprotected, without a spearman or woman in sight. They were frightened and absolutely flabbergasted, to put it mildly. They were still a few parsecs away from the work camp that they were supposed to put in order. Of course, they started back immediately, though they did have the presence of mind to close off the open end of the tunnel with a barricade of some hastily cut bamboo. Councillor Padam leant back in his chair with the air of job well done, and looked at Councillor Admeta. "Would you like to take over now, Admeta? You dealt extensively with Colonel Malek and Governors Demeter and Lehan about the security issues that followed." Councillor Admeta nodded briskly and began. When the advance team got back to their home village, a fair amount of confusion understandably ensued. At first, their story was treated with some skepticism, until the 3 village elders who had ridden off post-haste on their horses to investigate came back a few hours later and confirmed everything. That same afternoon, another advance team that had gone off to prepare the work camp for a big team of seedling planters who were going to start replanting a large section of forest that had been cleared and burned 3 moons before, returned with the same story. The same thing happened the next day. Similar stories also came in from 2 other home villages. All in all, 7 advance teams, all sent out to prepare work camps in the western parts of the forest, told about long sections of tunnels being gone. But this led to much worse. Because the security of the tunnel systems had been breached and had remained undiscovered, people started being attacked by the tox lizards and the death stalkers. In one horrible instance, a little girl playing in a tunnel literally meters from the entrance to her home village was killed within earshot of her mother and dragged away by a stalker. And because the bamboo forests are so vast, it took weeks for reports to reach everybody, so that work parties accompanied by spear carriers could check all the tunnels and make secure repairs where needed. It was a terrible time for the forest dwellers, and yet worse was to come. Councillor Admeta's lively face was very sombre now as she recounted these grim facts. She fell silent for a long moment before continuing. But let me not get ahead of my story. So, reports started flooding in to Governor Lhounds in Verdifane, the small principal city of the southern bamboo forests, although flooding in is probably something of an overstatement. Trickling in is probably closer to the truth, due to the significant distances involved. She dispatched some of her small force of home guards to help the forest people, but she also lost no time in sending an armed delegation on fast horses to inform us about it. Governor Lhounds' first delegation was in fact still here, when her second one arrived with yet worse news, and asking for urgent help. The second delegation reported that there had been attacks in the forests, and these attacks were not by death stalkers or tox lizards. Some workers sent to replant one of the missing tunnels had been attacked and killed. A big work party of 15 people on its way to clear and burn a newly harvested section of forest had all been killed, and the tunnel that they would have been using was freshly gone, literally still sawdust lying around on the ground where it had been cut away. And the accompanying spearmen and women lay dead next to their weapons. A family, presumably overnighting in a tunnel on their way to attend a relative's nuptials in a far-off village, had been killed, and again the tunnel was gone. And there had been other, similarly dreadful occurrences. In every instance, all the horses or ponies and some of the equipment, carts and wagons, food and such, were also gone. There were drag marks and wheel marks at each of the sites, as the ground was soft after the rainy season had begun. In many instances, the appalling events were made even worse by the fact that the tox lizards, in particular, had been feeding on the bodies of the dead. The mood in the Queen's audience chamber was now very sombre indeed. The visitors had listened to the grim tale in ever-increasing horror. Councillor Admeta was so distressed that she said, "Rade, would you carry on, please? I just need to sit quietly for a while." That is how our Lhound regiment, and Zendra and poor Owain, became involved. Councillor Rade began as she took over the account. "We had an emergency meeting here the very day Governor Lhounds' second delegation arrived, with Governor Demito from Gordofane, the commander of the Gordofane militia, Count Edo, and his second-in-command, Major Harrod Ram, and of course with Colonel Thomas Malek of our Lhound regiment. This resulted in an immediate decision to send a joint task force of 3 platoons of the mounted militia and 3 platoons of Lhounds and their mounted handlers to help the forest people. As Queen Aruda is commander-in-chief of both the militia and the Lhound regiment here, she commanded this task force. Fast couriers were sent off that same day, while the meeting was still in progress in fact, to Governor Lhounds to tell her that a task force was being sent directly to the large western home village, and to request her to meet us there. You will not believe how fast these couriers travel, especially if they use relays. They speed from way station to way station, literally just stopping to change horses, eat very occasionally to sleep for an hour or two, and then they are off again. The task force left the very next day after everybody had worked all night to get everything organized. Councillor Rade paused in her account and looked at the Queen. "Would you not prefer to take over now, Your Highness? I am sure our visitors would prefer your first-hand account." The Queen nodded and began. "We also travelled fast. Our supply carts followed behind more slowly, but even they set a good pace. We took only our very best horses and travelled as light as we could. Fortunately, we travelled along the Great Royal Road, which is by now very well supplied with good way stations, so we were able to get food and spare horses as and when we needed them. And of course, travelling through the Gordo lowlands and past the meltwater marshes, there was plenty of good grazing to be had for the horses. Indeed, we took to doing a great deal of our journey at night to allow the horses some grazing time during the day, and also to allow the Lhounds to hunt. I fear we did some damage to the wildfowl populations of the marshes, but we managed to cover the almost 3,000 parsecs to the western home village, the biggest settlement in the forests apart from the capital Verdifane itself, in marginally less than a moon. Governor Lhounds and her staff were already there. They had arrived a few days before us, and we set to work. Every work party that went out had a joint militia and Lound regiment component for protection, so work could proceed faster as strong temporary tunnels were built to replace the ones that had been removed. So the security of the tunnel system was gradually restored. Our main contribution was, I suspect, one of giving some feeling of protection to the forest dwellers again, though I am afraid that it will take a generation or two before they feel as safe and established in their very ordered way of life as they had once done. The Queen heaved a deep sigh. Damage done to people's spirits is hard to repair. Then she continued more briskly. There was only one more attack after we had arrived in the forests. It was unfortunate in the sense, of course, that one of our people was seriously injured, but also fortunate to some extent. The attack occurred on the very furthest western reach of the forest, where a very long tongue of fertile land pushes well into the foothills of the southern vastnesses, ending not too far from the snow line, in fact. The harsher climate and much lower temperatures that pertain there promote the growth of a particularly hardy and slow-growing type of bamboo, which is very dense in texture and accordingly much prized by the boat builders of Lower Meltwater Mere and Brownwater Lake. This bamboo is harvested on an ongoing basis, in smaller or larger quantities as required. A small team of workers, accompanied by spear carriers and militia, though no Lhounds and handlers were with them for some reason, were out there to begin harvesting the next day. They were camped in a makeshift bamboo enclosure that they had constructed in the middle of the only road there for increased visibility, and I think a mounted tunnel raiding party almost literally rode into them. This occurred during the early hours of a very dark, moonless night, so everything was very confused in the darkness, but the raiding party was successfully driven off and fled as fast as they could, having presumably not expected such strong and armed resistance. When their trail was followed over the next 4 days by 3 of the militia's best mounted tracker scouts, they found that the trail seemed to be leading straight in the direction of the huge snowfields that surround the glacier rim and the foothills of the southern vastnesses mountain range. The scouts lost the trail as the tracks finally petered out in the stony wasteland that stretches from the end of the so-called tree line, though in this case, of course, we're talking about bamboo, and the snow line. All remaining traces of the faint tracks they were following towards the end were in any case fast being obliterated as they went by an untimely snowfall that showed every sign of escalating into a blizzard, and as they were not really equipped for the weather, they were forced to turn back before they had any clear indication of where the tracks were leading. But they did estimate that at the time they were forced to abandon the trail, that they were only about 7 or 8 parsecs from the larger foothills around Frostfire Peak, one of the highest mountains in the southern vastnesses. Of course, like many of the other peaks in the range, Frostfire Peak is also an extinct volcano. The Queen paused briefly in her account for a sip of water before continuing. You are probably wondering why I made the rather strange remark that the attack was fortunate. Well, it was fortunate in 2 ways. The first was that it removed some of the abiding mystery of how the tunnels had been removed. In their haste to flee, the raiding party abandoned a long triple-axed wagon and the team of 10 massive cart horses that pulled it, with a 30-foot section of bamboo tunnel on it. As the wagon was following some distance behind the mounted riders who launched the attack, the horses were not spooked by the ensuing melee, but remained standing fairly docilely. On the wagon, our people also found a large quantity of rope, an ingenious handle-driven rotary saw, and an equally ingenious block and tackle system that clarified how such a large object could have been removed and then loaded onto a wagon. As Queen Eruda paused again, Practical Dane gave a brief exclamation of satisfaction. Ah, I thought it had to have been something like that. He was clearly relieved to have had this bothersome puzzle explained. Leonard also nodded. After a smiling nod at the 2 men, the Queen resumed in a thoughtful tone of voice. But they also left something else behind that I must admit I find quite singularly startling. The next morning our people found a dead Lound off in the bamboo thickets to one side of the road. It seemed to have been badly wounded, and we suspect it had crawled off to die quietly as they are wont to do. And this is the part that I think Anmar in particular might find interesting. Anmar sat forward in her chair, a small frown on her forehead as the Queen continued. This lion hound did not look like the Lhounds we are used to, she said. It was significantly smaller and stockier, with a less well-developed mane, and was a greyish-brown, almost silvery in colour, not tawny or copper-coloured or sandy like most of our Lhounds. A broad, heavily studded collar was found lying on the ground under the Lhound's neck. The collar had been badly damaged and in fact slashed in half, but we did see that it had a small quantity of a sticky substance, rather like window pane sealant, in a space between the two layers of elk hide it was made of. Our scientists have not been able to work out how it functions yet, but they were able to establish that this paste contained a minute amount of pulverized Bagnorian crystal. This time it was Lennard who straightened up in his chair. "Bagnorian crystal!" he exclaimed in amazement. "But that's what powers our stun swords. The crystals are very valuable and rare and not easy to get hold of." Councillor Padum confirmed this emphatically. "That is absolutely true," he interjected. "Our 2 crystal mines in the South Bagnor Mountains are only able to produce a relatively small quantity of these crystals, and despite extensive surveys having been done for years throughout the mountains, in both the southern and the northern ranges, no other deposits of the crystals have been found. And, of course, not all the crystals are powerful enough to power a stun sword. Many of them are too weak to be used like that." The Queen nodded at Lennard. "Yes, we found the presence of that little bit of crystal compound very intriguing as well, not to say somewhat disquieting." Her glance moved to Anmar. "Does this sound like a Lanatic Lhound to you, Anmar?" "Absolutely, Your Highness," Anmar responded positively. "They look exactly like that. Let me send you all a mind picture." Everybody received an image of a sturdy, powerful-looking animal with an alert facial expression and a beautiful silvery brown, slightly curly coat. Then the sending became heavily tinged with sadness. "Marder," Anmar said in brief explanation, and abruptly shut off her mind send. After a few long seconds of subtly respectful silence, the Queen started briskly gathering her papers together. "I think that brings us just about to the end of our meeting today. Only a few bits of information remain to be imparted to our visitors. Odd little and some not-so-little things have been happening around the palace, and Governor Demito tells me around Gordofen itself as well. People have reported theft of some personal items, and others have thought that their personal belongings and papers had been searched and riffled through. Papers have disappeared from the scriptorium, and one of Scribe Allen's assistant scribes had his dispatch case taken, and we are fairly definite that it was searched. The papers were in the wrong order when they found it again, and so on, and so on, and so on. Little things when taken individually, but I believe far more serious when viewed cumulatively. And vastly more significant incidents have occurred as well. 2 stun swords disappeared from the Lhound Regiment armory. We also found clear evidence that an unsuccessful attempt was made to break into my audience chamber here. And finally, and to my mind by far the worst, Scribe Allen found an anonymous letter in one of the drawers in his desk in the scriptorium, the very day of our emergency meeting with the arrival of Governor Lehon's second delegation, offering him 20,000 rals per moon if he would agree to spy on me and report regularly on my movements, and those of my son, the king, as revealed in his frequent correspondence to me, as well as decisions taken when we 4 are in close council. Allen was to be in a certain place at a certain time to signal his acceptance of the offer, after which he would have been contacted again for the first payment to be handed over, and for a method of regular communication and the transfer of information to be established. Allen, of course, came to me immediately, but we cannot depend on everybody approached in a similar fashion having the loyalty, strength of mind, and integrity to turn something like this down. It is a great deal of money. This whole matter was pushed into the background of my mind at the time because we were also occupied with the mission to help the bamboo forest dwellers, but it has been bothering me more and more since our return. It seems to aim so directly at the very heart of my administration. It is very worrisome indeed." For some moments the Queen looked weighed down by concern. "However," she continued, determinedly lightening her tone, "the point that I am making is that we are under attack. A quietly subtle and covert attack here in the palace, but an attack nonetheless. To what purpose this attack is being launched, I regret to say that I do not know, though I have some suspicions which, if true, may signal something very, very bad. So I want to ask you all to be vigilant and on the alert for anything that may seem odd or even marginally out of kilter. I also want to make the same request that I made before, Let your minds range speculatively, even fancifully, outrageously if you like, over everything we now know as a group. Somehow one of us must make a mental breakthrough that will bring at least some of the things that we know into a more coherent whole, hopefully giving us something to proceed with. Amid thoughtful nods and words of assent, everybody followed the Queen's example and rose to their feet, gathering papers and writing impedimenta together. From her desk, where she was deactivating the screens, the Queen spoke again. "Oh, and Paden, will you please take Dane now to meet Colonel Malek, and then Marrox, if the Colonel thinks this is a good time. And you and Zand will go along, please, Leonard, won't you?" They all agreed and were the first to leave the room, Councillor Paden leading the way. They were followed shortly afterwards by the scribe and the other 2 councillors. Anma, at a gesture from the Queen, had remained behind, standing with her hands resting on the back of her chair. "Just sit again, please, Anma," the Queen requested as she pulled out her own chair and seated herself as well. She sighed deeply and pushed the fingers of both hands up into her hair, whilst leaning well back into her chair in a tired gesture. "We have to talk about the best way of approaching Zendra, Anma. It is not going to be easy," she said. "I know, Your Highness," Anma replied. "I have been mulling it over, on and off all day long, and the only thing that I have been able to think of at all is just opening my mind to her and letting her see my own pain and loss, and then see what happens. It will not be easy, and I am quite frankly scared out of my wits, but I truly cannot think of any other way to start if I want her to trust me and consider having me as her handler." The Queen nodded slowly, but with obvious reluctance. "I agree, Anma, but I shudder at the danger of it. She could just lash out frantically and mind-scald you before you could get your shields up again to lock her out. I truly have to emphasize that she is not rational. She is literally almost mad with pain. And she is a huge and powerful Lhound physically, as well as a very skilled and strong sender." Queen Eruda's whole tone and demeanour betrayed the intense inner turmoil she experienced about the whole matter. And now it was Anma who leant across and laid a gentle hand briefly on the Queen's tightly clasped hands. "I am not too fearful, Your Highness," she said in a surprisingly serene voice. She gave the Queen her infrequent, sparkling smile. "After all, Your Highness, I will have you and Leonard and Zand to protect me." The Queen returned her smile warmly. "Bless you, child," she said. "That is indeed true, and we are a force to be reckoned with, especially in conjunction with that subversive beastie of Leonard's." She sat quietly for a moment, obviously mulling things over, then said, "Let us all meet here just before the noon hour tomorrow. I have 2 trade delegations to see first, but I am sure we will be done by then. I'll arrange with Colonel Malek and the Lhounds Surgeon Dell to bring Zendra across at that time. I just hope she will be willing to come. This is the best shielded place in the palace, and the amount of mind energy we might be generating could lift the cupola if we are not careful. Will you arrange with Leonard and Zand, please? We'd better have Admeta here as well, I think." The Queen concluded thoughtfully as she rose to her feet. She walked Anma to the door, where she laid a firm hand on the younger woman's shoulder. "It would be a wonderful thing if we could save Zendra," she said. "Her mother was my last Lhound, and I truly view Zendra as I would a daughter. To lose her will be heartbreaking." As Anma left the room, she determined to do everything in her power to help the stricken Lhound.